Sunlight lazily filtered down through the trees as the young elf laid on her back, one leg crossed over the other. She gazed up at the shifting leaves, arms behind her head and her foot bouncing aimlessly as she relaxed. Closing her eyes, a smile playing at the corners of her lips, the elf started to drift into a slumber, chest rising and falling slowly in rhythmic breaths. But she was pulled out of it with the sound of an incantation being cast, the soft pop of someone appearing after using a teleportation spell could be heard coming from nearby. Footsteps then began to approach, grass crunching beneath the individual's feet. Thura, why do you lay upon the ground? Is there not work you should be doing? Thuran'diel opened up one eye and raised a brow at her father. Maybe. I forget. The older elf rubbed a finger into his temple, hefting up a large tome under his other arm. Come now, I know that I told you to practice your arcane missiles. They could really use some work. Heaving a sigh, the younger mage pushed herself into a sitting position, scowling up at him. Oh, come on, Pops. What's the rush anyway? I have all the time in the world to learn it. Besides, don't you have other students to bother? Brenethil looked down his nose at his daughter, his fell green eyes flashing dangerously for a moment, before he softened and deflated. Fighting with Thura was never a winning battle. She had a certain affinity for magic, being born into the Sunstriker family, a line of powerful mages and scholars on both her father's and mother's sides. But she was stubborn, and had a certain level of laziness that kept her from fulfilling the potential her father knew she must have in her. Thuran'diel would learn, in her own time it seemed. And she was right. He did have other business to attend to, and had no time to be squabbling. Perhaps later he would speak with her about being more disciplined. Again. He sighed as the younger elf smiled sweetly up at him, sunlight glinting on the golden seams of her purple robe and her dark, wavy hair shimmering in the light. Fine, fine. You can stay here for a bit. But, I do want you to work on that spell, understand? The older mage said, wagging a finger in her face. All right, I will. Promise, she replied with a snicker, playfully swatting his hand away. Both of them turned as another elf appeared with a snap, sweeping her long black mane from her face casually, arcane auras still pulsing around her as she stepped closer. Thuran'diel grinned at her family. She strode over, giving Brenethil a gentle peck on the lips before cupping her daughter's face in her hands, kissing her forehead. Straightening, she turned to her husband. Sorry if I'm interrupting conversation, but we must be off now, yes? Giving his daughter one final reassuring smile before nodding to the new arrival and standing at his full height. Yes, yes. The magistrix and Fairbreeze will be waiting for us. Thuran'diel grabs a hold of Brenethil's hand, lacing her fingers with his, before looking back to the young mage on the grass. We'll be in a meeting for a while to discuss some new ruins in development, and then we need to run to the city to pick up a few things. Be back home in time for dinner, though, okay, Thura? Giving a toothy grin and a wave of a hand, their daughter replied, Right, sure, I'll be there. Have fun with your meeting and stuff. With a final wave, Thura's parents walked a few paces, still holding hands. Stopping after a short distance, they both bent in unison, bringing their other hands together low to the ground. Blue energy began to gather in their palms, and they slowly stood up, arcane energies gathering around them. Finally standing up fully, they nodded to one another before bringing their hands close to their chests. With a flourish, the energies that had been swirling and crackling in the air around the two mages crashed into them. Brenethil and Thuran'diel's forms seemed to rapidly be sucked inward until they both were gone with a pop. A small puff of dust hung in their wake. Thura blinked, watching the energies calm and dissipate before leaning back on the ground. Closing her eyes once more, the young mage let herself slip into oblivion. Opening her eyes with a snap, Thura sat up quickly as her shoulder was shaken. The force of the movement caused her assailant to fall back on his rear. With a growl, Thura glared at the individual. Seriously, Vem? You couldn't just let me lay here in peace, could you? Vimaria chuckled and then smirked at her from his place on the ground. Of course not. Bringing you misery and angst is my job, and I take it very seriously. Well, you're damn good at it, I'll give you that. Vimaria pushed himself up into a standing position, brushing off and smoothing out his extravagantly jeweled robe in a rather vain fashion. Offering a hand to Thuran'diel, he replies, Well, at least I'm good at something. She allows the other mage to pull her up to her feet, before scoffing, punching his shoulder. You know I hate it when you say things like that. Now, what do you want that is so urgent you had to disturb my perfectly nice nap, Slowly raising an eyebrow, he frowns in response. Oh, what? Me just wanting to see my dear friend Thura isn't a good enough reason? Before she could retort to that comment, the young mage swiveled as she felt a tug on the hem of her robe. There, she beheld Taliesin, her father's arcane familiar, seemingly trying desperately to get her attention. It waved its little arms around, its blobby, pink form pulsing as the two elves exchanged a look of confusion. She kneeled down to be face to face with it. As she did so, her father's voice erupted from within the familiar, a sort of recorded message, made with a very urgent and frightened sound to it. Thura, my DL, you need to come home now. Something is coming. We need to go. Please hurry. Time is short. The two exchanged another glance as the familiar rushed off in the direction of the Sunstriker home. Thura straightened, looking at Vimaria, who had his eyebrows raised. You wouldn't happen to have figured out your portal spell, would you? Something terrible was indeed coming, but what that was, the young mage could not yet tell. All she knew was that whatever was coming, it smelled horrible for some unknown reason, and was making quite the racket as it approached. Her breathing had grown ragged as she sprinted for her home, Vimaria at her side. She could hear the movement in the near distance over her labored breaths, clanging and clanking of armor, padding of many, many feet, and worst of all, blood-curdling shrieks of terror and agony. I need to go find Xandra before what is coming makes it to us, Ben said as he gave Thura a final wave, sprinting off to her right in pursuit of his sister. Thura skidded to a stop in front of her home, yanking open the door. The inside of the house was in total chaos. Her mother was rushing about in a panic. Her uncle Arizan was running up the stairs, arms waving about wildly. Turning on his heel after hearing the door open, Thuran'diel blinked over to his daughter, grasping her shoulders, his eyes wide with worry. Thura! Oh, thank the gods! Are you all right? She gazed up into his fear-stricken face with concerned eyes, her brow furrowed. I'm fine. A little winded, but fine. What is going on? He swiftly moved behind her, keeping his hands on her shoulders. He pushed her further into the house and towards the stairs. I don't have enough information to explain it to you, but we need to go. Now. Get what you can carry. Make it quick. She looked back at his retreating form as he sprinted to another part of the house. Vaulting up the steps, she narrowly avoided her uncle as he came storming down, frantically stuffing a sack with scrolls and books. In a few bounds, she was across the threshold to her small, cluttered room. Her eyes darted about. What should she bring? What did she even have time to grab? And why did they have to run? What was approaching that would frighten mages as powerful as her family to the point of panic? A small leather bag hung from one of her bedposts. Grabbing it, she rushed to her closet. Thura stuffed a change of clothes into the bag, as well as a few important accessories. Turning, she ran over to her bedside table. She stood before it, staring down at the items on its surface, considering. From downstairs, her mother's shrill cry filled the air. Thura! Come on, honey, we really need to go. Okay, I'm on my way, just a second. Biting her lip, she turned away from the table, cursing under her breath. She didn't need to bring it with her. It's not like they wouldn't be coming back, right? Rushing out of her room, bag slung over her shoulder, Thuran'diel grasped the head of the banister, swinging around it and propelling herself down the stairs. The rest of her family was standing in the center of the living room, each holding a bag bulging with various belongings, looking very tense. Windrunner's message to the Magisters said that we are to retreat to the city immediately. Irazan stated, unable to hide the fear in his voice. Thura looked at her uncle questioningly, opening her mouth to speak, but was cut off as her father grabbed her hand and pulled her over to them. The three adults stood around in a circle, all putting a hand on her shoulders. She looked to her mother, mouth still agape with an unasked question. Almost eye level with her now, Thura stiffened as she saw her own fear and uncertainty reflecting in Thuran'diel's fell green orbs. "To Silvermoon it is, then," Thuran'diel replied, giving his daughter's shoulder a squeeze. Similar to the spell her parents cast earlier, all three elder mages started to gather arcane energy in their free hands before touching their chests. Anchored to them by their other hands gripping her, Thura felt a pull in her gut as the incantation transported them through nether space to the city. Breath catching in her throat at the jarring transportation technique, Thuran'diel blinked, trying to take in all that was happening around her as she and her family appeared just inside the entrance to Silvermoon City. The jewel of the Eversong Woods and capital of the Sindor Eye, the young mage beheld the familiar sight of the towering elven statues, golden and curved architecture, and floating flower pots. What was unusual was the amount of tension in the area. They had moved into an area very congested with other elves, all wearing the same look of worry and fear on their faces as her family had. Many whispers could be collectively heard amongst the various clusters of elves, creating a sort of roar. "Okay, will someone please explain to me what is going on?" she finally blurted, her facial expression unable to hide her exasperation. "Thura, all we know is that," her mother started to say before being cut off. Crash! Stumbling as the ground shook beneath her, Thura turned to see a massive fissure that had been blown into the wall not far from where they were standing. Through the dust and debris, figures could be seen moving through the hole. A horrific, rancid stench filled the area as what appeared to be shambling corpses came into view, lunging and reaching for anyone and anything close to them. Screaming from the crowd rose like a crescendo as hell broke loose, elves darting everywhere in complete anarchy. Thura watched in awe as more and more of the terrible creatures poured into the city. They were taking elves down left and right, their cries of agony cutting through the cacophony of sound. "Move! Move!" Thuran'diel shrieked, gripping her hand, tugging her toward the exit, uncle and mother staying close. One of the ghoulish fiends was darting toward them, bones and sinew creaking with the movement. At the sight and smell of its rotting flesh, Thura had to clap a hand over her mouth and nose to keep from vomiting. With a flick of his wrist, her father set the creature aflame as they sprinted past. Beside them as they ran, Irazan and Thuran'diel were firing off spells of multiple kinds, blasting apart numerous corpses. Banging off of other elves, all approaching the exit, her family pressed closer together to not be separated. Thura winced, her father's grip so tight in her hand she thought it might be crushed. Pushing, the Sunstrikers finally made it out of the city, only to be greeted with more adversity. Even more of the undead army advanced upon them, some wearing spiked armor and carrying crude swords and axes. Their eyes gleamed with a cold blue, the unnatural reanimating spell rising from them as they chopped and hacked at the terrified elves. Thura and her family had halted, Thuran'diel frantically looking about to find the best route of escape. "Pops, why not just fight? Take a stand! Your spells seem to fend them off." Tugging at her again as he started to move to the left, turning only to make sure the family was still together, he shouted, "No, Thura! There are too many of them. We'll be overrun. We just need to keep moving." Just then, someone beside them was tackled by a ghoul, falling into their group and causing both Thuran'diel and her father to crash to the ground. Sputtering, the young mage struggled to her feet as quickly as she could. Undead creatures closing in on her. She brought her hands up, gritting her teeth with concentration. Thura tried firing off a few spells, but her father had been right. They still needed work, and there was simply too many of them for her to fend off alone. Her arcane missiles knocked off a few ribs and bounced off a few breastplates, but didn't stop her adversaries from advancing, weapons raised, dead mouths hanging open. Backing up, her heart jumping into her throat, Thuran'diel's mind reeled as she realized her own imminent peril. Several large blasts rocketed through the area, obliterating the ghouls in front of Thura. Thuran'diel came to stand in front of her daughter, her eyes wild, sweat running down her face. Brenethil had risen, and both he and Arazan were shouting for them to run. Rushing past, Thuran'diel grabbed Thura's hand and started to pull her after the men. One of the undead nearby had enough of its arm and upper body intact that it was able to swing the axe in its hand as the two ran by. The blade of the weapon digging deep into her mother's calf, both Thura and Thuran'diel went down as the wound caused her mother to fall forward. Letting go of her hand, Thura pushed herself up from the dirt as Thuran'diel wailed. Eyes wide with shock, Thura started to rush to the Elder Mage's side, but her enemies were faster. No, no, no! Minda, watch out! Thura shrieked as another armed ghoul stood above her mother, both hands on the hilt of its jagged sword. In her desperation, the young mage tried to form an incantation, her fireball missing completely. Thuran'diel struggled to push herself onto her back, raising a hand as if to cast another spell. The movement was too slow and came much too late. The ghoul plunged the sword downward, through the elf's chest so it protruded out her back. Thura was frozen in place, rooted to the spot as crimson blood burst from her mother's mouth. A dark stain was spreading on her decorated robes as the ghoul pulled the sword from her flesh, already forgetting his victim and moving on to the next. He charged Thura. She didn't move. She couldn't. Every fiber of her body screamed at her to move, electricity in her veins, but she remained where she was, staring in awestruck horror. Thuran'diel's body had gone limp and slumped down, the surrounding ground progressively being stained a sickening dark red. Thura only shifted her gaze from her mother's lifeless body to then stare death in the face. The ghoul was upon her, its eerie blue, magic-filled eye sockets flaring as it raised the weapon dripping with her mother's life fluids. A surge of arcane energy blasted the fiend to pieces, a hand gripping her shoulder. She was being pulled back, but made no protest to the movement. She had lost all control of her limbs as tears started to stream down her face, mouth hanging open in a silent scream. Her father's and uncle's pained faces swam in and out of view as they pulled her away. All sound had been deafened, only a loud ringing in her ears before everything